For years, one question has haunted the wolf among us, a mystery with only 2 possible answers, each capable of reshaping the story in a completely different way. In this video, I'll dive into the long-running Faith versus Nerissa debate and explain why, against all odds, I disagree with the conclusion most fans have accepted as fact. Without further ado, let's uncover the dark truth about who we've really been speaking to all along. On a dark, cold night in New York City, Bigby responds to a call from Mr. Toad, a routine disturbance at first glance. 2 Fables are at each other's throats, Faith, a working girl, and the woodsman. Their argument over payment quickly turns violent. After the woodsman lashes out at Faith, the fight escalates until Bigby steps in, sending both of them crashing straight through the wall and out into the street. Here's where we truly get to know Faith, an ordinary Fable forced into a grim line of work just to survive in a world where their own leaders have failed them. And she's the spark that ignites the entire story. Her severed head appears without warning on Fabletown's doorstep, setting off the investigation that unravels a hidden web of deceit, crime, and trafficking. The real question is this though: was the girl we met in the introduction truly Faith, or was it Nerissa in disguise the entire time? Nerissa, like Faith, works the same job for the same employer, and both leave Bigby with the very same line:
"You're not as bad as everyone says you are."
With one girl dead, only 2 possibilities remain. Either Faith was killed before Bigby ever met her, and the woman in the opening scene was actually Nerissa in disguise, or Faith really was the one Bigby encountered, and after Nerissa's off-screen death, she used a glamour to make Nerissa's body appear as herself. In that case, the severed head belongs to Nerissa, and Nerissa was never truly part of the story at all. For years, the community has largely accepted the first theory, that Faith was never really in the story and it was Nerissa all along. But that theory is riddled with major plot holes. Since it's the most widely believed explanation, let's break down why it simply doesn't hold up. The first major problem with this theory is that it relies on Bigby meeting a fake Faith, so he'll be shaken by her death. For that to work, Nerissa would have needed to predict 2 things: that the woodsman would turn violent and that Toad would call Bigby. That level of foresight is impossible. The woodsman also never reports anything unusual about the Faith we saw. If it were really Nerissa in disguise, you'd expect her to slip up, misunderstand a reference, react oddly to something he says. Yet the woodsman never notices a thing. To support this, Faith's severed head still shows the fresh bruises from the woodsman. For those marks to appear, the glamour must have been applied after the beating. If either woman had been glamoured as Faith before the attack, those bruises wouldn't line up, because the injuries could only appear on the body that was actually struck. Again, if Nerissa had been disguised as Faith all along, how could the severed head show bruises from a beating that supposedly happened after Faith's death? Furthermore, why would Nerissa even choose to glamour herself as Faith in the first place? And for how long? If she were taking on Faith's clients and work, that would mean an enormous workload and a fortune in glamour expenses the girls clearly can't afford. The game repeatedly shows, especially in the ending, that no one in Fabletown cares when someone goes missing. Lawrence, for instance, lay near death for days before anyone stumbled upon him. The simplest, cheapest move would have been to let Faith fade into obscurity. That rules out the possibility that the Crooked Man or anyone else was funding this disguise to keep it hidden. However, what we actually see is Georgie training Nerissa to dance at the pudding and pie. That's odd, because Faith and Holly's sister Lily worked as companions, while Nerissa, based on context, was already a dancer there. Why would an experienced dancer need more training? To me, this strongly suggests it's Faith learning to step into Nerissa's role as a dancer, not Nerissa preparing to take Faith's place as a companion. Now that we've dismantled the arguments against Nerissa being Faith, let me explain why the idea of Faith becoming Nerissa makes far more sense. First, Faith's encounter with Bigby and her realization that he's far far kinder than his reputation, lines up perfectly with what follows. It's easy to imagine her retrieving Nerissa's body, disguising it as her own, and leaving it on Fabletown's doorstep to draw Bigby's attention, all while quietly stepping into Nerissa's life. When we actually speak to Nerissa in the game, she never shares anything truly personal. Everything she says is common knowledge. The most intimate detail she offers is that, as the Little Mermaid, her current legs are real and she paid a lot of money for them. But where would she even get that kind of money? And why not simply use a glamour instead? Faith, however, already had real legs. That either strongly suggests this isn't the real Nerissa, or reinforces the idea that Faith is impersonating her and sticking only to well-known facts. Even when Nerissa recounts her own fairy tale, she tells it exactly the way everyone knows it, without adding any personal perspective. This matters because we're told Snow White's story is merely Mundy fiction, and Tim isn't even tiny anymore. Clear proof that many fable tales are outdated or outright wrong. Yet Nerissa's story matches the Mundy version perfectly, right down to the smallest detail. That's more than a little suspicious. My final point, one many overlook and perhaps the most important, comes from a subtle visual clue. We know Faith and Bigby both smoke. We see it right at the start of the game. Later, in the Shepherd's Factory, just before the Bloody Mary fight, there are photos of Faith and Nerissa. Only Faith is shown smoking. Nerissa isn't depicted with a cigarette until the very end, and in the office scene, when she shares one with Bigby. So if Nerissa isn't a smoker and Faith is, it makes perfect sense that she'd be the one smoking at the end. The comics, I can almost hear some of you shouting through the screen. Yes, there is a panel where Nerissa says, "I have faith," but to me that doesn't prove Faith was never in the story. The most obvious reason is simple. The entire game and its long-awaited sequel hinges on that twist ending. There's no way the writers would spoil their biggest mystery in side comics that most players would never even read. To me, it feels more like fuel for the fire, meant to keep the mystery and debate alive, or simply an intentional wink to the audience. Even so, people often overlook that the clue cuts both ways. It could hint that Faith becomes Nerissa, or that Nerissa becomes Faith. It isn't definitive, and I don't think it was ever meant to be. A third theory many fans have embraced is that it simply doesn't matter. Some argue that the writers intentionally built loopholes into both sides because the answer is irrelevant. The mystery itself is the point. In this view, Faith and Nerissa are treated as so insignificant that it genuinely makes no difference which one lived or died. This theory is arguably the most plausible, since everything we know about The Wolf Among Us 2 suggests it won't continue the first game's storyline or bring back any of its side characters. The intended message matters far more than the literal truth. Ultimately, whichever side you land on, the third theory feels the most realistic. If you agree with me and believe Faith survived to the end, I'm glad I could persuade you. If you think Nerissa was the mastermind all along, that's a completely valid take. But in the end, the answer matters about as much as these women mattered in their own world. And sadly, that isn't much at all. This video would not have been possible without my members: Dog, Wizard Elf, Eternal Canadian, Rossmo, Beatbox Blade, Donny, Poop and Sock, Fresh Pokemon Hunter, Thy Oasis, Skullskills777, Alexander Brantley, and Chesburger. You guys honestly keep this channel running, and as always, a shout out to anybody watching this far. It honestly means the world to me. Thank you.